In Revelation 1:1, we find what the book of Revelation is about and who gave the revelation. Revelation 1, verse 1 states, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly come to pass. And he sent and signified it by an angel to his servant John." So it's the revelation of Jesus Christ, not of John, as some believe. And it was given to Christ to give to his servants about events of the end time and the day of the Lord. Today, I'd like to go over a portion of that and begin our probably two-part series on the first 7 seals. Let's begin in chapter 5. It is chapter 6 that goes through the first 6 seals. But in chapter 5, we kind of have a segue and a lead up to chapter 6, where we will spend most of our time today. But in Revelation 5, verses 1 through 3, and then we'll read a few more sporadic verses after that. In Revelation 5, verses 1 through 3, we see the opening of the seals and how these things could not take place until a certain time. But Revelation 5, verse 1 says, "And I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne," and again, this is God the Father, "a scroll written inside, and on the back sealed with 7 seals." So if you can imagine a scroll rolled up, and you have the seal on it, and different seals then allow different pages to come open, well, then this is, at least in my mind, a visual that I have of the way that it appears, or at least they're trying to show us in terms of, this being who lives in a spiritual realm to us who live in a physical realm. And so it was sealed with 7 seals. And then I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and loose its seals?" So it had been sealed up till the end time, but there was no one that was worthy to go and reveal what was going to happen. No one in heaven, verse 3, or on the earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look at it. Verse 5, "But one of the elders," one of the spirit beings up there, "said to me, 'Do not weep. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has prevailed to open the scroll and to loose its 7 seals.'" So now, not only, and again, obviously we're talking about Jesus Christ here, who is the Lion of the tribe of Judah and the Root of David. Okay, so now not only is he able to open the seals, but to loose, as it were, the contents therein. Again, in an order and at their right time. Verse 7, "Then he came and took the scroll out of the right hand of him who sat on the throne." This is God the Son going up to the Father. And then verse 9 says, "And they sang a new song saying, 'You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain and have redeemed us to God by your blood out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation.'" So again, very pointed description of Jesus Christ and what he did. And by doing those things, quote unquote, he became worthy to then go take the scroll and to open it up and to not only that, but even reveal it to us. And I'm not even going to go through all the mechanics of that, but suffice it to say that it was not until a later time that the understanding of this could even happen. So now, moving to Revelation 6 and verse 1. So in Revelation 6, we have, and this is the way I always remember it, the 6 seals. So Revelation 6 talks about the 6 seals and even introduces the 7th. So beginning in verse 1, it says, "Now I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, 'Come and see.'" So this is now the introduction to the first 4 at least, and we'll continue on even past that later on. But the first 4 horsemen of Revelation, as they're called, or the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Now, I think a lot of people misunderstand what apocalypse means. It's used 18 times in the New Testament, And believe it or not, it's only once used in the book of Revelation. Apocalypse, the word apocalypsis, means revelation. It means to reveal. And what we have here and what we already saw in chapter 1, verse 1, is that this is the revelation of Christ. Christ is revealing, through John, information about things that will come to pass in the end time. And so when people think of apocalypse, they think of this dystopian society or the world coming to an end. And again, they can be excused for thinking that, but it really means, okay, the revelation, the four horsemen that have been, and what they're going to do that are revealed. Now, there's a whole bunch of other things in the book of Revelation that aren't nearly as catastrophic as this, but again, it's all part of the end time. And I don't know that we're ever going to get past this in terms of the word apocalypse and what it connotes, but at least for the Bible student, I wanted to just make this very clear, since we're always in search of the truth and the understanding of it. So what we have then is these four horsemen, as they've come to be known, the first four seals of Revelation, of the apocalypse. Verse 2 of Revelation 6. So now we get into the first horseman. It says, "And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer." So I find it interesting, in the very first one, the very first horse here, the white horse, is just an immense amount of confusion. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about in terms is Christ who reveals. We don't get to apply, whatever private interpretation we have to the verses. We have to let the Bible interpret the Bible. And immediately, many people have become deceived by the white horse and what it means, because it's most often associated with Christ. But here, it is not representative of him. In fact, it's meant to be deceptive. So we have a rider on a white horse, has a bow, has a crown, and he went out to conquer and conquer. This is the first seal. And as we know, these seals are going to open up a considerable amount of devastation on the world. But yet, this is not the coming of Christ, as many believe. That doesn't happen until much later. In fact, let's go over to Revelation 19. Revelation 19 and verse 11, and we'll read down through verse 15. And this is what we have to understand. When I talk about private interpretation, of course, I'm referring to the scripture that says that scripture is not of private interpretation. We don't get to come up with our own narrative, our own story as to what these verses mean. Just because it makes up a good story and makes sense to us in some respect, it doesn't make it true. And it doesn't mean that there's a whole bunch of different ways that it can be seen. And what we see here, though, it is subject to the biblical interpretation. In other words, letting the Bible interpret the Bible and making it marry up, and in that way make sense. So in Revelation 19, in verse 11, it says, "Now I saw, and heaven opened, and behold, a white horse." So we see that. "And he who sat on him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war." So, of course, now we have a very strong case to be made that this is the one that is Christ. And it is indeed him, the one that's faithful and true and righteous. So he is the one here riding this white horse. "And his eyes were like a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns." All right, so now we're starting to differentiate. This other rider only has one crown. Okay? Now, Christ returning has many crowns. In verse 13, he had he was clothed with a robe dipped in blood. All right, and again, reference to what he did as the Lamb of God. "His name is called the Word of God, and the armies went with him," in verse 14. And then 15, "Out of his mouth goes a sharp sword." All right, so now we have the other differentiation here, is that it's not a bow, but he goes out with a sharp sword that he should strike the nations. And of course, we're here in chapter 19, which is sequential at this point in time as to what's happening in chapter 6. They should strike the nations, and he himself will rule with a rod of iron, and so on and so forth. So again, Christ is depicted in many places as having a two-edged sword or a sword. In fact, let's go back to Revelation 2 and look at one of those places. And we'll also look at something else there too. In Revelation 2, verses 12 and 13. It says, "And to the angel of the church in Pergamos," so there's 7 churches. And it says, "But to the one in Pergamos write, these things says he who has the sharp two-edged sword." So if your Bible is like mine, this is in red. It's Christ speaking here. And this is him who has that two-edged sword. So it confirms that. It confirms it in many other places as well. And then verse 13, this is something I also don't believe many people realize and understand, but he goes, "I know your works, where you dwell, where Satan's throne is." So Satan has a throne on earth. And he is called the God of this world or the God of this age. And it has been left to him. This is what Christ had to do when he came and he fasted for 40 days in the temptation, was that he then qualified to reign over the world. And he's not going to take Satan's throne. He's going to come back with his own. But nonetheless, what we see here then in verse 2 is that the white horse here does not refer, the horseman, the first horseman, does not refer to Christ returning, but refers to the fact that the religious deception is now going to be released upon the world in even a greater way than it has before. Because this is the beginning of the 7 seals, right? And here's the other thing I kind of alluded to before, is that it's at the end, okay, of the 7 seals and the 7th trump that Christ returns. So his return's not for a considerable amount of time later. And so this, again, cannot be Christ. So instead, it refers to the deception, and specifically the religious deception that's going on in the world, and the ability for this to happen and to take advantage and deceive those that are in the world that are not firmly grounded in the truth. So Satan's deception obviously began at the very beginning with Adam and Eve. He lied to them and told them that they weren't going to die, and that they could know good and evil, and that they could decide for themselves what was right and wrong. And we see now, after 6,000 years, how that has worked out. And it obviously hasn't been very good. But it wasn't just Adam and Eve. In 1 John 5, 19 and 20, it says that the whole world lies under the sway of the wicked one. But we know that the Son of God came, and he gives an understanding that we may know him who is true. Right? So again, it takes that specific insight from God through the Spirit of God working in us to understand what is true and what is false. And those who do not have that at this point in time are under the sway. They are being deceived by Satan. And they're being fooled, even to the point that they don't even believe that he exists. But Revelation 12:9 says, okay, yes, there's one, well and truly, that great dragon, the serpent of old, the devil, Satan, and he deceives the whole world. So he's the one that's the enemy. He's the one that is our adversary. And he is that great deceiver. In 2 Corinthians 4, verses 3 and 4, we see that this religious deception has been going on. And it's going to continue to go on. And so it should come as no surprise that when this seal is opened, that people are being deceived. And this has happened from the very beginning. As soon as the church was formed, in terms of Christ and his initial coming. Galatians 1:6-7 just talks about how the church was so quickly deceived. And Paul was marveling how quickly this happened. And it can happen very quick if you don't hang on to the trunk of the tree and to the foundation and the chief cornerstone. But in 2 Corinthians 4:3-4, it says, but even if our gospel is veiled, it's veiled to those who are perishing. Right? So the gospel is not seen, is not clear. The truth, in other words, the truth of God is veiled. It's a shield. It's put in front of their eyes. And we see in verse 4 why. It says, whose mind the God of this age, a reference to Satan, the devil, has blinded. Right? So again, we see, and we're looking at the mechanics of how this is working. And it's not just the people, but it's the leaders as well. I mean, they're putting out information, and people are believing what they're saying. Ezekiel 22 and verse 26, I'll just read it to you real quick. It's talking about, it says, her priests have violated my law, profaned my holy things. They have not distinguished between the holy and the unholy, nor have they made known the difference between the unclean and the clean. So what we have here is that the priests couldn't distinguish between right and wrong. And they're passing down wrong, bad information, selfish information, no doubt, to the people who are also believing the wrong things, even though they were shown and told what the right things were. And again, these things do not take long. And the issue, too, is that we have to be careful, or it's going to happen in the church as well. Let's turn over to Matthew 24, read a few of the verses over there. And again, Matthew 24, and here's the interesting thing, and this is part of the revelation of God, is that it parallels Revelation 6. Of course, this was given, some 70 years beforehand? Approximately 60 to 70 years, maybe I should say, before Revelation was given. And what we have is, in some respects, an expansion of it, but we have a harmony of these two, and you put them together and you get a more complete picture. But this is Christ's longest prophecy that he gave as Jesus, because the disciples sat down with him on the Mount of Olives, and they came to him privately and they said, tell us of when these things will be. What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And he immediately starts out with what? Religious deception. He says, take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. So what we have here already is Christ prophesying that this indeed is going to happen and will happen, that people will be deceived. And again, the emphasis here to a large degree is, okay, if you have the truth, you better make sure that you hold it fast. Because verse 11, many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. That's not just in the world. In verse 23, it says, then if anyone says to you, look, here is Christ, and there, do not believe it, for false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders and deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. Therefore, if you say, look, he's in the desert, don't go out. Look, he is in inner rooms, do not believe. And so what's going to happen here in the very end is that once this religious deception is, again, accompanied by many signs and lying wonders, people are going to fall for it, hook, line, and sinker. And they're going to go all in and say, okay, this is the Christ. I mean, who else can be doing these types of miracles and great signs and wonders? Okay, and they're going to fall for it. The miracles are not a sign of Christ. And also, what we're looking at here is a chronological line of events that are going to happen before the return of Christ. And the very first one that they're talking about is religious deception. And this, again, should not be a marvel to anybody who has read the Bible. He says, in fact, 2 Corinthians 11, and I'll begin verse 12. We'll read down to verse 15. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 12 through 15. We need to understand that this is not a big thing. I think we place too much importance on miracles. And it's not a big thing for the spirit realm to do these things that we cannot do in the physical realm. And again, it's not a big thing. That's what we need to understand completely. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 12. For what I do, I will also continue to do, that I may cut off the opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded, just as we are in the things of which they boast. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ. Okay? Again, do not underestimate human nature, and especially if it's being influenced or aided by the demonic realm, in terms of what they will and can do and just how good they can be at it. Verse 14, he says, and no wonder, okay, that these people can do this. For Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works. So he's saying it's not a big thing. It's not a great, fantastic deal that they can do this if Satan can fool others and make them believe that he is a good angel. Right? So do not be deceived. It's going to happen. It has been happening, and we're being warned. And then again, I'll put it in your notes. 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 1 through 10. Again, it's talking about, that these things are going to happen. And the problem is that there's going to be a falling away first before these things happen and come to full fruition. But Paul is talking about how these things are already at work, and that the coming of the lawless one in the end is going to be according to the works of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, which I was referring to earlier, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish. Okay. Those who perish are the ones that do not have God on their side. If we expect to, continue to be saved, then we cannot be deceived by these things. And it's a constant battle. So this time of deception, it's here now, and it's only going to get worse in the very near future. And that's the first seal. The second one is war. Revelation 6, verses 3 and 4. And when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, come and see. Another horse, fiery red, went out, and was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another, and there was given to him a great sword. So what we have now is this following on from this change in religion. Especially, as we see the false prophet and the beast power begin to work together, war is going to ensue. And again, this should not be, I don't think, a mystery to us, especially the connection between religion and war. We have today things like the Israelis versus the Palestinians and basically everybody else there. And that's constantly in the news as they try to push the nation of Israel into the ocean. They own, or they represent like 1% of the people there, and nobody can stand to have the Jews there in Israel, while everybody else is a completely different religion. It's this Judaism versus Islam. But here's the thing. It doesn't stop there, because we also see in the Middle East Muslim versus Muslim. You have the Sunni versus the Shia, and etc. And even the Sunnis, if, say, whichever one, it doesn't matter, the Sunnis beat the Shia or the Shia beat the Sunnis, when that would be over, and say there's no more of either one of those, within them, they have their own factions of what they believe. And so I don't think there'd be any end to it, but yet everyone feels justified to go and kill on the basis of their religion. And it's not going to be any different. In Matthew 24, verse 6, it says, "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." So the Greek here implies that they're actually going to be hearing wars. I mean, they can hear the wars in the battle in the distance. And then they're also going to hear about others that are going on as well. And then verse 7, it says, "For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." Okay, we're talking about war here. This is, again, the Olivet prophecy that we were just in a minute ago. "And there will be famines, pestilence, earthquakes in various places." So what we have right here are the seals 2 through 4, right, summed up, and then some. Again, we start getting to fill in some of the other spaces, because there's going to be a lot of things going on top of what is already going on. But these kingdoms, these regions, and the way that they're going to be divided up, typically politically, are going to be having wars between these divisions, maybe even civil wars, and between countries and states, and etc. And what we see here, again, in verse 7, right, we see war, famine, pestilence. And then it says earthquakes in various places, where it adds that. And we'll also see talk of wild beasts. While those are not specifically the seals, they are events that are going on at the same time. And again, once a seal is open, it doesn't close. So the deception continues. And once war starts, the war continues. And as we go on and see here in the other ones, it seems as though one seal begets the next. It is a part of the problem, it's part of the influence, it's part of the reason that the next seal begins to happen. Also, what we see here is that there's an escalation. Right? And this is, when the first 4 seals open, it's going to be really bad. It's bad, and has always been bad, as these things continue to progress and to escalate. But what we see here also is that it continues, right? Once we get to the trumps, we see that the beast attacks over in Revelation 9. And then the 6th trump, the Asian hordes, the powers, retaliate with a 200 million man army. And then Revelation 13 and verse 4 and 5, again, let me just read this one right quick for you. It so they worship the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" And he was given a mouth to speak great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months, right? 1,260 days, 3.5 years. So we have then war. This is associated with the beast power here in the very end as well. And we're going to get into that a lot more here when we get to the 5th seal. So I don't want to get ahead of it. But the 6th plague is what people call Armageddon. It's the preparation for the final battle, which Zechariah 14 talks about, where they go up from Armageddon, which is about 55 miles away. And then that's where Christ then later comes and fights them. But I don't think most of this, and this might be one of the easier ones to see, because people say, "Oh yeah, wars have been going on all the time." But here's one of the little clues. In fact, let's go look at it over in 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 1 through 4. 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 1 through 4. And see this little insight that we're going to have that will help to define and offset the second seal, which is the red horse, which is war. First Thessalonians 5, verses 1 through 4. It says, "But concerning the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I should write to you. For you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night." Again, so he's saying here that we're going to be able to discern the times and the seasons, not the day, but the general time of when these things are going to happen. And also, it's going to come like a thief in the night, when most people are not prepared, and when the thief can do the greatest amount of damage. But then here we have verse 3, the key. "For when they say peace and safety," right? We're going to look at this, and we're going to look at like, okay, everything's completely good. And people are going to say, "Oh, yeah, we're everything's so peaceful, so harmonious. Everyone is safe now." And they're going to obviously rely on themselves, and they're going to misapply the events that are going on. He says, "But when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, are not in the darkness, so that this day should overtake you as a thief." So again, that's why, part and parcel of why we're going over these seals today. It's not only as a witness to the world that these things are coming, and that they were prophesied well beforehand. This is almost 2,000 years ago that this was said. Right? And again, it was planned even longer than that. But for the naysayers, they can look at this and they'll say, okay, here's going to go. And there's still going to be people who, when all these things happen exactly the way that the Bible prophesied this is going to happen, they still won't believe. Right? So that being said, to a certain degree, then we are talking to the believers here. And God says these things are going to happen, so you can bet that they're going to happen like every other prophecy happened whenever God wanted it to happen. And he's orchestrating these things. He's allowing them. And even in this way, we see that God's working among men, among those who are not accepting of him. But he has to make sure the prophecy has happened. So in some cases, he allows things to go their natural way. And again, it's not a surprise when the natural way of man is the way of Satan, who is foisting his mentality and his attitudes onto people. And this is why people are, for the large part, very predictable, because Satan hasn't changed. And he's the main influencer in their world, in this life, like we were talking about before. The whole world lies under his sway and are deceived by him. But now we know, okay, this is what's going to happen. Right? And so when they say peace and safety, yes, you know that the end is very, very near. And so we don't live in darkness, we live in the light, and we won't be fooled, or it won't come as a surprise like it will be to many other people. And the other thing about it here, and we can take a certain amount of solace, but it also at the same time tells us how bad it's going to be. But in Matthew 24 and verse 22, and again, we keep going back and forth between these two to show the parallels and to get different insights and to make all the prophecy more full. But Matthew 24 and verse 22, it says, "Unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened." So it's going to be so bad. And I think we've heard this for the longest time already, that with the current weapons of mass destruction, we have the ability to kill every man, woman, and child on this earth many times over, if not hundreds of times over. And it only takes one. But it's going to become so bad that if God were to allow it to go, yes, we would completely destroy ourselves. And so this idea that, yeah, we could, in terms of, say, movies or other people's books and novels and whatnot, that, yes, we could completely obliterate the earth is a reality. But God says, okay, for the sake of my elect, the sake of the ones that he's working with at this day and time, and to a large degree for the sake of everyone, because he has a plan that he's working out for everyone, those days will be shortened. They will have to be shortened because we are coming to a point in the history of mankind, unlike any other time, where all of mankind will be faced with imminent extinction. And that's the second seal. Let's go back to Revelation 6 and verse 5 and look at the third. Revelation 6 and verse 5. When he opened the third seal, speaking of Christ, opening the third seal, revealing it, allowing it, loosening it, I heard the third living creature say, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a black horse. And he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. And do not harm the oil and the wine." So a denarius here was representative of approximately a day's wages. So when we start thinking and say, put that in our terms, and we say, okay, how much money do I make in a day? And that's enough for a quart of wheat or 3 quarts of barley. And what we see then is a quart of wheat was also approximately the amount of food that a person would eat in a day. And that barley was the lower quality of the foods, but you could get 3 of them. So if you are working, and if you have other people relying on it, if it's only you, then quote unquote, you're going to eat better than a family of 4. But if you're not, then you're going to have to go and get the cheaper food. And again, I'm being facetious because the quart of wheat, if that's all your subsistence is, that's not living. Not the way that anybody, especially in America and most of the modern nations are living today. And so you're going to have this. And it was a practice of mixing the barley with the wheat to make it go further. Or, like me, I've eaten barley by itself. Of course, it was nice and hot, and I think I had some honey to put on it, and it was just one of many things that I was eating for breakfast. And so the point is here, though, things are going to be scarce, and they're going to be expensive. So no longer will we be able to afford the things that we used to afford. And we're starting to even see that right now. Okay, again, the inflation rate is going up, and it's already starting to impact the food that we buy and how much we can buy. It's not going as far as it used to, period, because we always have a little bit of inflation, and then we're having more inflation, and then we're going to get to the point where this is all that you can afford for a day's wages, which becomes very expensive. Say you're making, for sake of rounding out, $100 a day, and which is a fairly low wage now. But imagine that that $100 a day just buys enough food for the day for you, in one sense, or you have to spin it out in different ways, get cheaper food to buy it for more people, for the rest of the family. It's going to get bad for a number of reasons. And what we also need to realize is that the preceding 2 seals lead to the third one. It impacts. There's a correlation as well. But before I go further into that, it says, do not harm the oil and the wine. So I have to admit, I don't know exactly what that means, but it appears to be that there is going to be some oil and wine, which again are considered a luxury in some respects. In others, to me, it's almost a necessity to have some of the oil for some of the cooking. But the word there for harm is not completely clear what it means. It also says unjust. It's one of the other definitions of the word for harm is unjust. So in the sense, to me, it says don't be unjust with the oil and wine. Be careful how you use the oil and wine. If you have it, you're not going to have it much longer. You're not going to have much of it. And the reality is, I'm sure there's going to be many people who don't have it, but when you do, then you better be judicious with it, as it were. Again, the overall concept, though, is that, yes, this is famine. It's a time of leanness. It's a time when things become difficult to afford if you can actually get it at all. And again, I go back to, when I was in college, I remember talking to this one Czech guy, and he said, we had the money, we just didn't have the stuff. So they would go, and he'd go in line, and he'd talk about getting up at 4 in the morning, be in line at 5, a long line of other Czechs who are waiting just to get some of the basic necessities. There was a famine. They didn't have the food, even if they had the money. And so it becomes a big issue here in terms of being able to live like the kings that we live like right now. And that's another thing. We do live like kings. Go look at some of the, even in the Bible in ancient times, the way that they ate at the king's table and the way that they feasted. And you go, I eat like that once or twice a week at least, if not more. And so, yes, we do live in a time of great abundance and great blessing because of promises God made to Abraham and how those blessings were passed on through his lineage. But all that is coming to an end. And I think we can begin to see that and get an idea for that right now as we speak. Let me just reference this one article. I'll read some parts of it, of what's happening because of the most recent conflict that's going on in the Ukraine and Russia. Right? And I think we're all quite well aware that that's happening. But there are other, consequences and effects that are going on due to the fact that there is war going on there. And it's having a far-reaching effect because over in Harare, over in Zimbabwe, it talks about this security guard, Edwin Dapi, who was struggling already to provide for his wife and his 4 children. And the conflict, this is the way the article goes, says the conflict away in Ukraine sent global prices for grains, cooking oils, fuel, and fertilizer soaring. So again, I thought this was apropos in terms of, it's talking about the grain, i.e. the wheat, the oils here, and then even the ability to grow the food. And then he talks about his monthly pay is now being stretched to the breaking point. He reached for a 2-liter or half-gallon bottle of vegetable oil, but it was more than he could afford. And so was the 2-kilogram bag of flour. He said, I keep hearing it's because of Ukraine, but I don't know what that has to do with us. He said, scratching oil and flour from his grocery list. So again, how apropos is that? How salient is this article, which was written May 10th, which was only less than a week ago, as to what's going on due to this single conflict that's going on in the Ukraine and with Russia. United Nations agencies are warning that price hikes sparked by Russian invasion of Ukraine will worsen a food crisis in Africa. Last year, sub-Saharan Africa accounted for nearly 2/3 of the 193 million people considered to be acutely food insecure worldwide. And that number, too, that's, again, food insecure, but there are nearly 1 billion people around the world already that are persistently hungry. They're always hungry. And they're not getting enough food. More recently, back to the article, its economy has been throttled by drought, cyclones, rolling electricity cuts, foreign currency shortages, and runaway inflation. So he's talking about how the problem is becoming worse because of drought, because of foreign policies, and because of inflation, which we were just talking about. To make ends meet, Doppy said he was making plans to move. I must reduce my rent, school fees, because everything is going up except my salary. Across Africa, food insecurity is on the rise. More than 2 million children are at risk of starving to death in the Horn of Africa, where parts of Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia are facing their driest conditions in more than 40 years. So in Ethiopia, a civil war has pushed hundreds of thousands, have pushed hundreds of thousands of people into famine conditions. So again, the correlation between the second and third seals. We made a correlation between 1 and 2, now between 2 and 3. Millions more are at risk in the South Sudan, where a war that ended in 2020 caused widespread destruction and compounded by some of the worst flooding in generations. Not only is it lack of rain, it's too much rain that causes problems. West Africa, and again, we're moving around the country. Zimbabwe is kind of the southeast. Ethiopia, Eritrea up at the northeast. And again, those two are associated with famine for as long as I can remember. Now we're moving over to the other side to West Africa. It's worst food crisis on record, driven by Islamist insurgencies that have forced millions of people off their land. And that region has also seen worsening floods and droughts. The conflict in Ukraine is making a dire situation even worse. And that's what we're talking about, is that, yes, we are in bad times already. And when these seals are open, these bad times are going to be insufferable. They're going beyond imagination in terms of how bad they're going to be. He says the war has disrupted shipping in the Black Sea, a major artery for grains and other commodities, throttling exports from Russia and Ukraine to markets including Africa. The Ukraine war's impact is overlapping with a crisis that has already been unfolding in some African countries. We have a very grim outlook going forward. And that's the end of the article. But the points are salient, in fact, of what we're all reading in Revelation 6. And in particular, it's talking about how the war's impact is overlapping with a crisis. And that's what we're going to see, is once the seal is open, it remains open. And they are going to overlap. And the war is going to overlap onto famine. And the famine, what we're also seeing here, is being brought on by all kinds of things. Drought, too much rain. And then in the past, we've seen how insects can do it. And now we're seeing supply chain issues where it's saying, oh, we just can't get the stuff to you. And the stuff does exist here, there, or where. But the bottom line is that everything's going to continue to get worse. And this was all prophesied. This should not be new to anyone. Again, the Bible is so prolific right now that everybody should have at least one, if not more. It's electronically available. And in it, back in Deuteronomy 28, again, we understand Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26, the blessings and cursings chapters, says, okay, yeah, these things are going to happen in the end. Deuteronomy 28, verses 17 and 18. Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed shall be the fruit of your body and the produce of your land, the increase of your cattle and the offsprings of your flocks. So the meat is not going to continue to produce like it has and propagate. The produce of your land is not going to be there like it was in the past. And then 23 and 24, verses 23, 24, it says, and your heavens which are overhead shall be bronze, and the earth which is under you shall be iron. The Lord will change, okay, this is God doing it, will change the rain on your land to powder and to dust. From the heaven it shall come down on you until you are destroyed. God has the control of the weather patterns, and there's not going to be rain as part of the cursing that's being pronounced here. and the earth is going to dry up, and things are not going to grow. And there's going to be plagues. If you want to go down and read verses 38 through 42, that's what we were alluding to earlier in terms of the insect. It's in my knowledge and in my memory, some of the locust plagues, how they come through with swarms of billions of them, and they just, totally devastate a crop in a very, very short time. And so because of that, you're not going to have your vineyards. Okay, you're not going to have the wine. In verse 40, you're not going to have the oil. So in a sense, we're the ones doing the harm to the oil and the vine because of our actions. And because of that, those things are not going to happen. They're not going to grow. We're just going to be without the quote-unquote luxuries that they're emblematic of. And the locusts are going to consume all the trees and all the produce of the land. And we, the world, will be without. And that is the third seal. Revelation 6, verses 7 and 8. We come to the fourth seal, the fourth horseman. They all are going to ride together, and it's going to be devastating. It says, when he opened the fourth seal, and I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, come and see. So I looked, and behold, a pale horse. Now, pale, the word there is chloros, like Clorox or chlorine. And if any of you know the color, I remember, Clorox back in the days pouring it out, it was always this yellowish green. And I don't know if you've ever seen a chlorine gas cloud, but they're kind of yellowish green. And it's this sickly, deathly type of color that I imagine that this pale horse is. It's a chloros colored horse, right? And appropriately named because the name of him who sat on it was Death. And Hades, or the death, followed with him. And power was given to them, okay, this is the four horsemen, over a fourth of the earth, to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, by the beast of the earth. So again, we can, if you have any doubt whether this is pestilence or pandemics or whatnot, or disease, again, we just go back to Matthew 24, verse 7, says, nation will rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and pestilence. Okay, so we have war, famine, and pestilence. And so as a part of this ongoing sequence of events, this fourth one's coming out. It's going to be the capstone, is that the right word, for these four horsemen and what they're going to do. And with this fourth one comes things that are going to make COVID pale in comparison. COVID's nothing compared to the fact that 25% of the world's going to die from these things. Right now, the number of people who have died from COVID has been considerable, yet it's, in the scheme of things, the scale of things, has not been that much. And of course, every death is valuable. Every life is valuable, and nobody wants anybody to die per se. But this is the reality that we bring upon ourselves. And it's not unprecedented. There's been so many things so much worse, like the Black Death, which wiped out so much of Europe and other parts of the world. The Spanish flu, which, again, seemingly the flu is not, quote unquote, that big of a deal, though it's typically on par with COVID and what goes on with COVID. But the Spanish flu was very devastating. And, by certain estimates, it's somewhere between 25 to 50 times more devastating than COVID ever was. And then we had other things throughout history like smallpox and yellow fever and malaria, which again, we see these little bitty things that are calling, we say little microscopic diseases and viruses that, we can't fight. We can't fight the little things or the big things here. And it's mosquitoes that are the main culprit in terms of the disease of malaria. And then you have polio. And then on top of that, we could have biological weapons, right, that can bring on these diseases And there's no doubt that there's going to be some of that. In Deuteronomy 28, again, Deuteronomy 28, verses 21 and 22, and 59 through 61. Again, in the blessings and cursings chapter, it talks about pestilence and disease being a part of the cursings that will come upon people. It's prophetic. Deuteronomy 28, verses 21 and 22, it says, "The Lord will make the plague cling to you until he has consumed you from the land which you are going to possess. The Lord will strike you with consumption, with fever, with inflammation, with severe burning fever, and then with the sword and scorching and with mildew. They pursue you until you perish." And then verses 59 through 61. "The Lord will bring upon you and your descendants extraordinary plagues, great and prolonged plagues, and serious and prolonged sicknesses. Moreover, he will bring back on you all the diseases of Egypt, which were afraid, and they shall cling to you. Also, every sickness and every plague which was not written in the book of the law will the Lord bring upon you until you are destroyed." Again, what we're seeing here then is that, it's going to be the worst of times. And the things that we're seeing are just the beginning of, it's just the tip of the iceberg of how bad it's going to get at the time of the very end. And here's the thing that, again, I'm trying to be avoiding saying, but in Deuteronomy 28, let's read verses 1 and 15. And we see why these things are going to happen, and also the solution to avoiding these things if you want to. There's a way out. There's a way to avoid having to go through the deception, the war, the famine, the pestilence, and the other seals, which we're going to have to cover next time. Deuteronomy 28 and verse 1 says, "Now it shall come to pass, if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all his commandments, which I command you today, that the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth." And then you can read verses 2 through 14 and see how God will bless if you obey, if you keep all his commandments. Again, it doesn't matter whether you believe this or not. It's true. It will happen. Okay? Now, if you believe it, you can get on board with it. If you don't believe it, then ignore at your own peril and be faced with the things that are going to happen in the future, happening to you. And I don't know that I can overstate just how bad it's going to be, because it has been so bad in the past, as I've tried to illustrate. And even in recent history, it's been very bad. It's going to be worse. And why are these things going to happen? Verse 15, "It shall come to pass that if you do not obey the Lord, the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all his commandments and his statutes, which I command you today," okay, in this time period that he was commanding them, go back and you can go read what those commands and statutes are, and how they are then even magnified further in the New Testament, not done away with, but made even more enjoining, that if you do not observe carefully all his commandments and statutes, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. Okay, it doesn't matter, again, what you think or what you believe or what you don't understand as to, again, I'm inserting the voices of people that I hear and they go, "Oh, God doesn't do that. God's not like that. God's not like that. That's not a just or fair or a compassionate God." It actually is. It's just you don't understand how things work and why this is going to be the case. And the reason is because God, in his love and his caring for us, wants to bring everyone to repentance. He wants them to change from their wrong ways to the right ways. Okay? So that they can have a better life and they don't have to suffer. That's what he wants. But sometimes he has to get our attention. And this is the way that he goes about it. Cause and effect. And the reason that he wants to bring everyone to repentance, everyone, and it's going to happen more so in the end time, just preceding his return, is so that he can usher in this new age of peace and harmony and abundance and health. And he's going to do that with the knowledge that we find in this very book that we've been reading from. And it's going to go all out over the world. And it's going to envelop it to where everybody then understands and has their mind opened and is living the right way, that it's going to benefit not only them, but the whole rest of the world.